By early 1865, the bloodiest conflict ever fought on American soil was nearing its end. Yet the Confederacy still existed for one reason: the Army of Northern Virginia still existed. But that army was collapsing just as rapidly as the government it defended. Months of brutal siege warfare had drained its manpower and crushed morale, and Robert E. Lee knew his position around Petersburg could not be held indefinitely. Still, surrender did not come naturally to Lee. Even though the odds were overwhelmingly against him, he convinced himself that victory was still possible, if he could attempt one final gamble. But that last gamble was destined to fail, and with its failure, the American Civil War marched toward its end at Appomattox Court House. Welcome to the grand finale of our Civil War series, Siege and the Beginning of the Big Dig. Neither the Army of Northern Virginia nor the Army of the Potomac wanted a prolonged siege at Petersburg after the misery of Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. Yet Burnside's 9th Corps, many of whom had served at Vicksburg, dreaded trench warfare more than anyone. One regiment, however, proposed to end the stalemate in a bold and unusual way. The 48th Pennsylvania Infantry, made up largely of former coal miners, believed they could dig a tunnel underneath the Confederate line. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasants, a mining engineer, surveyed the ground and concluded the plan was workable. He proposed digging a mine shaft from his unit's position to Elliott's Salient, a key Confederate fortification. Burnside loved the idea and took it to Grant and Meade. Grant thought the plan was unlikely to succeed, but since it posed little risk and kept the men active, he approved it. The distance to the target was over 500 feet. Even if the Confederates didn't hear the digging and didn't build countermine shafts, military engineering doctrine required long tunnels to have air vents, which would be easily detected. Grant gave permission but offered no supplies. He was far too occupied with cutting the Weldon Railroad and handling Early's operations in Maryland. The tunnel is completed. Grant was shocked when Pleasants returned in late July announcing the mine was finished. His men had dug a 511-foot tunnel with a 75-foot gallery for explosives, using improvised tools and timber stolen from an abandoned bridge. They solved the ventilation issue by building a makeshift air exchanger using the chimney draft effect. The Confederates detected digging early on and began countermine attempts, but their shafts completely missed the tunnel, helped partly by Pleasants intentionally rerouting the tunnel to avoid discovery. Now only the powder was needed. Burnside had selected Edward Ferrero's division of United States Colored Troops to spearhead the attack. He trusted them deeply, and because Grant had kept them in the rear throughout the overland campaign, they were eager to prove themselves. Burnside spent weeks preparing them for the assault. Engineers would clear the path. The lead units would swing around the crater. Follow-up troops would flood the trenches. Reinforcements would move around the crater, widening the breach. If all worked perfectly, the Confederate center would collapse, and Petersburg might fall in a single morning. Preparing the assault, Grant approved Burnside's plan and ordered powder for the mine. To increase pressure on Lee, he instructed Hancock to cross the James and attack the trenches at New Market and Glendale. Although Grant didn't expect a breakthrough, he hoped Lee would thin his Petersburg line to defend Richmond. Sheridan's cavalry was also ordered to raid Richmond if possible. The July 27th attack succeeded strategically. Lee shifted all his reserves to counter Hancock and Sheridan. Grant then scheduled the mine to detonate at dawn on July 30th. But George Meade was deeply uneasy. He believed that even if the mine created a massive gap, Lee would plug it quickly and use flanking fire to annihilate the assault force. He also doubted the combat readiness of the colored troops and privately hoped the entire plan would quietly fail. When the tunnel succeeded, Meade argued against the attack, but Grant refused. They had a perfect tunnel, abandoning it now made no sense. Running out of options, Meade ordered Burnside, at the last minute, to replace the USCT with a white division. Burnside protested bitterly. Grant reluctantly agreed with Meade, influenced by political pressure. The 1864 election was approaching, and the administration feared heavy black casualties might provoke backlash. Heartbroken, Burnside had his remaining division commanders draw lots. Fate chose James Ledlie, an incompetent drunk whose troops were exhausted. Burnside explained the plan carefully, but Ledlie simply told his men to go forward after the explosion. No briefing, no preparation, no engineering support. The Battle of the Crater, At 3:30 a.m. on July 30, Pleasants lit the fuse. After a delay, the mine exploded at 4:44 a.m. 278 Confederates were killed instantly, and survivors fled. It took officers 15 minutes to reorganize the terrified Confederate survivors. Meanwhile, Ledley's unprepared troops panicked as well and waited nearly 10 minutes before advancing. Ledley failed to send forward engineers to build footbridges or clear debris, causing chaos before the attack even began. By the time the Union reached the crater, Confederate reinforcements were already pouring in. Grant later called what followed the saddest affair I have witnessed in this war. Instead of moving around the crater as planned, Ledley's men rushed directly into it. Its steep walls trapped them, turning the pit into a killing zone. Grant and Meade ordered the attack cancelled at the same moment. Burnside, desperate to salvage the operation, pushed Ferrero's USCT forward. Meanwhile, both Ledley and Ferrero were discovered miles behind the line, drinking rum in a bomb-proof shelter while their men died. Union casualties totaled 3,798, compared to 1,491 Confederate losses. Burnside was blamed and relieved of command. Ledley resigned in disgrace. Ferrero faced severe criticism. But post-war analysis, including Grant's own report, placed ultimate responsibility on Meade's last-minute interference. The siege dragged on. The siege continues. The crater was Grant's last and best chance to break through. After its failure, he simply deepened the siege, extending trenches until Lee's army was stretched far beyond its limits. By November, Grant's line ran from Mechanicsville north of Richmond to the Boydton Plank Road southwest of Petersburg. Only 2 railroads still linked Richmond to the outside world, and supplies were running dangerously low. Sherman begins the Carolinas campaign. Meanwhile, in Georgia, General William T. Sherman completed his march to the sea by capturing Savannah on December 21. Grant congratulated him and ordered him to sail north and trap Lee. But Sherman refused to join the stalemate at Petersburg. Instead, he proposed marching through the Carolinas to destroy the last Confederate supply bases. Sherman believed Lee's soldiers would fight to the end, but starving armies cannot fight long. Destroying their food sources, he argued, would end the war faster. Grant agreed. Sherman prepared to leave Savannah, forming pioneer units from thousands of escaped slaves who had followed his army, many of them skilled at swamp construction. Under Union engineers, they built corduroy roads and bridges through the rain-soaked wilderness. By mid-January, Sherman was in South Carolina.
Sherman invades South Carolina. Sherman cut his supply lines to move faster, carrying only ammunition and relying on foraging until he reached North Carolina. Orders were strict. Take only needed food. Destroy property only under Corps commander's orders and only as retaliation. But South Carolina was the birthplace of secession. Many soldiers saw this as an opportunity for revenge, and discipline often broke down. Sherman advanced rapidly. Confederate commander P.G.T. Beauregard couldn't determine Sherman's true target and attempted to defend everywhere at once, effectively defending nowhere. Sherman feigned advances on Augusta and Charleston, but his true objective was Columbia, the state capital and a vital manufacturing and rail hub. Wade Hampton's cavalry withdrew on February 16. Sherman occupied Columbia on the 17th. That night Columbia burned. Contrary to Lost Cause myth, Sherman issued no order to torch the city. Fires set by withdrawing Confederates, burning cotton bales, high winds, drunken Union soldiers, and looters created an uncontrolled inferno. A third of the city was destroyed. The Confederacy tries to regroup. Richmond starved through winter 1864-65. Desertions skyrocketed. Lee lost 8% of his army in January alone. Sherman's advance forced garrisons across the Deep South to flee rather than fight. Finally recognizing Davis's failures, the Confederate Congress stripped him of control and appointed Lee general-in-chief and restored Joseph Johnston to Western Command. Davis resisted, but Congress overruled him. A proposal to enlist enslaved men in exchange for freedom was rejected. Even in the face of collapse, white Southerners preferred defeat over emancipation. Lee plans his escape. Lee knew Richmond could not survive the spring. With only 50,000 effectives and starving animals incapable of moving artillery, remaining in the trenches meant annihilation. Johnston urged him to link their armies in North Carolina. Together they might defeat Sherman and retreat into the mountains to prolong the war. Lee initially refused but by March accepted that this was his only chance. He prepared to evacuate Petersburg and Richmond at the earliest opportunity. Sherman enters North Carolina. Sherman's men entered North Carolina on March 8. Unlike in South Carolina, they encountered no desire for vengeance. Many North Carolinians had opposed secession. Thousands had joined the Union Army. Sherman moved in two wings, not expecting resistance. But Johnston had rebuilt his army by absorbing Bragg's and Hardee's forces. Although outnumbered, Johnston realized he could defeat one wing of Sherman's army if the two wings drifted far enough apart. The Battle of Bentonville. On March 15, Sherman's cavalry met Hardee's defenses at Averasboro. After two Confederate lines were overrun, Hardee withdrew. But the delay separated Sherman's wings, giving Johnston the opening he needed. At Bentonville, Slocum's column collided with Johnston's army. Mistaking the Confederates for a small screening force, Slocum attacked with one division, only to be beaten back. At 3 p.m. the Army of Tennessee launched a fierce assault, collapsing the Union left except for one well-fortified division that held firm and prevented a full rout. Reinforcements arrived and Johnston withdrew. On March 20, Sherman refused to make a frontal assault, wanting his men to survive to see victory. On the 21st, a Union reconnaissance almost outflanked Johnston, but Sherman mistakenly recalled it. That night, Johnston admitted to Lee that he could not stop Sherman without major reinforcements. The Appomattox campaign begins. Lee had no choice but to retreat, but his army and animals were near collapse. Meanwhile, Grant had already set March 29 as the start of his final campaign. Fort Stedman. On March 25, Lee attempted to preempt Grant with a surprise attack on Fort Stedman. Confederate troops infiltrated the lines disguised as deserters and captured several Union batteries before dawn. But instead of pushing forward, many starving Confederate soldiers stopped to eat abandoned Union breakfasts. Reinforcements closed the gap and drove them back by 7:45 a.m. Lee lost 4,000 men he could not afford. The fall of Petersburg and Richmond. On March 29, Sheridan and Warren struck Lee's right at Five Forks, routing Pickett's division and cutting the South Side Railroad. Davis was informed Richmond must be abandoned. Grant launched a full assault on April 2. Longstreet held firm but A.P. Hill's corps collapsed. Hill was killed attempting to rally his men. That night, Lee evacuated Petersburg and Richmond. Government officials fled with Treasury gold. Fires set to destroy supplies spread throughout the capital. Lincoln entered Richmond on April 4, greeted by crowds of freed slaves. The chase. Lee aimed to reach Amelia Court House for supplies, but food had been mistakenly sent to Danville. Soldiers scattered to forage, costing Lee precious time. As they regrouped, Lee abandoned a third of his wagons and artillery due to exhausted animals. Sheridan's cavalry caught up. By April 5 to 6, Lee's army was blocked at Sailor's Creek, where 7,700 Confederates were killed or captured, including General Ewell. Lee pressed on but Sheridan blocked his escape routes. On April 8, Custer seized Appomattox Station, capturing Lee's last supplies and blocking the road to Lynchburg. Lee was trapped. Appomattox Court House. The end. At dawn on April 9, Confederate troops attempted to break through Sheridan's cavalry, but halted when they saw 3 Union infantry corps blocking the way. Lee sent word that he was ready to discuss terms. Grant rode to meet him at the home of Wilmer McLean, whose first house had been used during the First Battle of Bull Run. "The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor," he later said. Grant offered generous terms: parole, personal horses, officer sidearms, and rations. Lee accepted. The Civil War was effectively over. Aftermath and assassination. Celebrations erupted across the North while despair overtook the South. But tragedy followed. On April 14, John Wilkes Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln. Booth was eventually killed. The conspirators were hanged. Sherman negotiated surrender with Johnston, who capitulated on April 26. Confederate forces east of the Mississippi surrendered by early May. Davis fled but was captured on May 10. West of the Mississippi, Edmund Kirby Smith held out until June 2. The last Confederate general, Stand Watie, surrendered on June 23. The war was finally over. Series conclusion. The American Civil War remains the deadliest conflict in U.S. history. Over 655,000 soldiers died, along with tens of thousands of civilians. 2.1% of the American population was killed, proportionally far worse than World War II. The South lost 18% of its population, its economy, and its political dominance. Its infrastructure lay in ruins. The lost cause myth would emerge to justify the devastation, but the truth was clear. The Confederacy destroyed itself to protect slavery. Ironically, the war spurred massive cotton production in Egypt, Brazil, and India, ensuring that even if the South had won, its plantation economy was doomed. Thank you for following this extensive series on one of the most defining events in American history. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, comment, and share.